But first, I wanted to talk about my new top 5 because I tweeted it out on Saturday night, and USC hadn't beaten Arizona State yet. And so I was like, well, listen, I know what my top 5 is. I just wanted to get it out there because I know it was different. And my top 5 changed dramatically, in part because of what we have seen over the last couple of weeks. So let's get started. My new top 5. Let's get started with number 1, Ohio State.
Stroud under center. Defensive line adjusts. Stroud hands Mayan Williams, and he'll get into the end zone for his 3rd TD of the day. Mayan Williams. Ohio State punches it in for one more score.
All right, so everyone's up in arms, down in the South over me putting Ohio State number 1. But this was what it came down to, folks. I had 2 distinct tiers in my top 5 in my mind, and I'm going to walk you through the exact philosophy of why each team landed where they did in this top 5. Ohio State was number 1, and the only other team in the discussion, in my own discussion with myself, was Alabama. So those were my top 2 teams, and I was trying to figure out, okay, how do I want to rank these 2 teams? Well, you've got to parse them out. And here's what it ultimately came down to for me was the fact that Alabama is a great team. And by all the metrics and the analysis, I was going to put them at number 1. Alabama was going to be my new number 1 team. But the problem is that there were 2 things getting in the way of that. The first being the fact that Ohio State has shown some serious depth and defense, the 2 Ds for Ohio State, that I think right now are as impressive as we've seen across the board. So they haven't really had their healthy weapons on offense, and they're showing tremendous depth. Mayan Williams, who you heard in that clip, goes off last week. And granted, it was a win over Rutgers. So, I mean, does it really matter how well they played? Well, some think no, but I think it does because there were guys that they weren't planning on relying on doing this. Mayan Williams being one of them from the running back position. They also have not really had a healthy Jackson Smith-Njigba, who really is their best offensive player outside of their quarterback, and they haven't had him all year long. And it hasn't stopped them from being the best offense in the country. So they show their depth, but it's also their defense. Their defense right now is 14th in the country in scoring and 10th in total defense. They're playing really well on that side of the ball. A drastic improvement from what we saw over the last couple of years, in which years that the defense was their clear Achilles heel. It was their clear weakness. So depth and defense has made them a very balanced team. Now, that doesn't mean Alabama is not a balanced team. So, Joel, what you just told me that by every metric, so it couldn't just be the depth and the defense for Ohio State. And you're right. It wasn't just the depth and the defense. But that balance allowed me to look at this situation and say, okay, if these teams played this week, because remember, this is a poll for this week. All right, this is not a rolling scale like the official World Golf Rankings, where I'm going to go back 2 years and say your body of work over an entire 2-year period. No. This is a snapshot in time this week. What are you this week? And quite frankly, I think Ohio State would beat Alabama this week. Therefore, they got the number 1 spot because Bryce Young and his shoulder, we don't know how healthy he is. Now, there's optimism around his shoulder, an AC joint sprain, which, by the way, I've had in both of my shoulders. I had one totally blown out, one more of a mild sprain, which it appears to be for Bryce Young. I'm sure he can play through it, but I'm sure it's going to be painful. And I think that that's a health issue that would prevent Alabama from beating an Ohio State. We already saw Alabama struggle with a team that could line up on offense with really talented players and get after them, and that was Texas. That first quarter, Alabama was in trouble down in Austin because Quinn Ewers could throw it around. They had speed on the outside. Remember, Texas had 5 5-star players starting just on the offensive side of the ball. So they could line up and really get after it, even against Alabama's great defense. And that offense, as talented as they are for Texas, they're not close to, 1, as talented, 2, as good as what that Ohio State offense is. So if they played this week, I would pick Ohio State. Therefore, Ohio State was my number 1 team this week. This is a snapshot, folks. It's October 2nd. Who's the number 1 team in the country this week? It's the Ohio State Buckeyes. And for that reason, I put Ohio State number 1 and Alabama number 2. It had everything to do with Bryce Young's shoulder. If Bryce Young is healthy, I put Alabama number 1 because I would say Alabama would beat Ohio State in that world. But not right now. So Ohio State goes in there, and they're my number one team in the country this week. This snapshot. Alabama is number 2. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, where the hell is Georgia, Joel? Because weren't you talking about last week that it's clearly a 3-team separation? Yes, but they were not in my top tier discussion. They were not in my top tier deliberation. They were in my second tier deliberation. Second tier. Important. And very important. So where did Georgia end up?
And you know what? It's going to be really hard next week, too. And it's going to be really hard the next week. And it's going to be really hard 2 weeks after that. It just doesn't change. And you guys may think it's going to be easy at some point, but I promise you, it's going to be really hard in the SEC every week.
Yeah, we get it. And I mean, this is always the narrative. Oh, it's so hard. It's so hard to beat Missouri, who got absolutely crushed by Kansas State by 28 points. But it's so hard for Georgia to go into Missouri and dominate that team. It was so hard. Kent State's not in the SEC, and you were at home. So why were you in a 10-point game in the fourth quarter with Kent State? By the way, is it easier to win in other conferences on the road? Was it easy for Michigan to go into Iowa City and win in Kinnick when Iowa has beaten 4 of the last 5 top 5 teams that they faced in that home stadium? I'm pretty sure that's a better track record at home than Missouri. This notion that this conference has some sort of mysterious power where it's harder to win on the road in the SEC than it is at other places is false. It's false. That's bias, that's narrative, and don't buy it. You know where it's hard to win? At really good teams. It's hard to win at Clemson, but they're not in the SEC, Joel. Yeah, but they've won 37 straight. It was tough for Clemson to win at Wake Forest on the road. League road games are tough across the board. Ask Iowa State, who rolled into the booth and got beat by Kansas. You bet it. You bet it. I cannot stand this narrative that all of a sudden in that conference, it's harder to win on the road. Missouri's no good. They got housed by Kansas State by 28 points. 28. Granted, it wasn't at Missouri, but still, 28? And all of a sudden, Kirby Smart's going to go out there and quite frankly lobby everyone around the country by saying like, oh, don't think down on us. It's really hard. It's really hard. Michigan's win at Iowa was much better than Georgia's win at Missouri. Not even close. So I started my second tier by putting Georgia number 5 because you can't play like this in a snapshot poll. Remember, this is October 22nd, October 2nd. This is a snapshot. You cannot play the way that they've played over the last 2 weeks, regardless of what they did week 1, and stay at number 1 or in the top tier, frankly, which is why they fell out of the top tier and landed at the bottom of my second tier. Kent State got beat by OU by 30 and by Washington by 25. And Kent State was in a 10-point game with Georgia in Athens early in the fourth quarter. Georgia ends up beating them by 17. Okay, maybe you can explain that away. It's like, hey, they just didn't play great that day. All right. You know what? I'll buy that. I'll buy that. And guess what? I did buy that. And in my snapshot last week, it didn't affect Georgia. But then they rolled out there and didn't have a lead against Missouri until the 4-minute mark of the fourth quarter. So don't all of a sudden start throwing around this garbage like it's tougher to win at Missouri than it is in other places. It's not tougher to win at Missouri than it is at Wake Forest or at Iowa, which is exactly what the other 2 teams in my tier 2 did over the last couple of weeks. So how did Michigan and Clemson wind up at 3 and 4? Well, let's start with Michigan. Michigan, I'm just thoroughly impressed with their balance. There were 2 questions coming into the season about Michigan. One was about their quarterback and whether he was going to be able to raise the ceiling of this team. Now, at the time, the quarterback was Cade McNamara. And I was wondering, like, hey, what's going to happen at the top end? Are they going to go with J.J. McCarthy at some point, who might have a lower floor but clearly a higher ceiling? And guess what we've learned? Now we've learned that J.J. McCarthy has raised his floor to a point where he can go into a location like Iowa City, not turn the ball over, and really play a very efficient and sound game. So now all of a sudden you're getting the best of what Cade McNamara gave you and the athleticism and top-end ceiling of what J.J. McCarthy can give you. They haven't even scratched the surface of what they can be on offense. Their touchdown to Donovan Edwards in that game, There's a free rusher. Lucas Van Ness from Iowa is just totally free. And he just steps away like it's a normal, Saturday. Hey, I'm just going to step away like it's a scrimmage, like I got a red jersey on and just throw it out there. Now, granted, at Michigan, they probably don't wear a red jersey, probably yellow jersey. But, you get the gist, like the don't hit me jersey. It looks like he has the don't hit me jersey on and he just steps away and throws a touchdown. That's the top end. Meanwhile, they have established that they can still get after the passer, which was the other question I had about Michigan. So now Mike Morris has established that he can go out there and get after the passer, and they've still got the best special teams in the country. That's a terrific win. Iowa had the number one scoring defense in the country, and with 30 seconds left in that game, the score was 27-7. Thoroughly dominated all facets. The offensive line, by the way, I think this Michigan offensive line is one of the best offensive lines in the entire country. So they landed at 3, and by default, really, Clemson goes at 4. Now, why Clemson over Georgia at 4 and Georgia at 5? Well, the bottom line is this is a snapshot, folks. Okay, so I'm not worried about what happened necessarily in week 1, although that's part of it. But it's got to be a smaller part of it than what has happened over the last couple of weeks. So what have we seen over the last couple of weeks? Well, Clemson went into Wake Forest where they were 17-2 in their last 19 home games, and they beat Wake Forest. That's a good offense, and they beat them in overtime. And DJ Uiagalelei had to be great, and he was. Then they come home to their toughest test in the regular season, NC State, and they handled them. And that offense has clearly taken steps forward. That was the main question about Clemson coming into this season, and here they are answering that question, saying we can put a great offense on the field, and they're doing that. And right now, with that defense, with that home field advantage, and with the fact that they're going to win that division, they've beat Wake, now they've beaten NC State, they're going to the conference championship game. I think it's almost in pen that Clemson's in the college football playoff at the end of the year. Almost in pen. They're number 4 for me. I really love what this team has done from a growth standpoint from week 1 to now in the snapshot of what we get on October 2nd. You can't say the same about Georgia. They have not played as well of late. This is not, hey, they throttled Oregon. Yep, they sure did. And they're still in my top 5. But you can't play the way they've played over the last 2 weeks and stay in the top spot. You just can't. So that's how my top 5 rolled out. Ohio State number 1, Alabama number 2, Michigan number 3, Clemson number 4, and Georgia number 5. Everybody, how in the world could you do that? Well, I just explained it, folks. That was the philosophy behind it, and I will stand by it till the end of time. It's not really the end of time, though, because remember, it's a snapshot. And next week, I'm going to have another snapshot. So we'll see how that comes out next week. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoy that clip, make sure you click subscribe somewhere down here. From game highlights to exclusive interviews and rankings, we've got everything you need as a college football fan right here, College Football on Fox.